So here is something we've been meaning to talk about for a while. Which states are the worst when it comes to climate change? To get started, we looked at the top greenhouse gas emitting states. What we found was not surprising. Texas leads the pack, but just how bad is it? Well, let's take a look. It turns out Texas is so bad that it's the equivalent of adding a country to this list. Now, we're gonna go through why it's number one, what's driving its emissions, and what's being done about it. But before we do that, if you like staying up to date on the most important news and stories happening in America, make sure you stay tuned. When it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, Texas is by far the biggest emitter in the United States. Its emissions are higher than those of any other state and are growing faster too. According to a report by the Rhodium Group, between 1970 and 2021, Texas' total carbon dioxide emissions across all sectors, homes, businesses, transportation, etc., have increased by nearly 85%. From 1970 to 2021, every other state in the U.S. saw emissions increase by less than half of Texas's rate, with North Dakota coming in second at 40%. And even though Texas is by far the biggest emitter, its emissions only increased by 1% between 2016 and 2021. But that might be small consolation given that this was after a record-breaking 5 consecutive years of emissions growth from 2012 to 2015. The Lone Star State is home to 8 of the top 10 counties with the largest emissions increases from 2016 to 2021. So just how bad are things in Texas? Well, real bad. Currently, Texas emits over 800 million tons of greenhouse gases each year, which is more than the next 4 largest states combined. Just to put into perspective, this is about the same amount as Germany, which has a population that is about 2.5 times larger than Texas. When looking at per capita emissions, it would be like comparing the entire state of Texas against a country with the size of Germany's population. If that doesn't hammer home how big the problem is in Texas, then maybe this next stat will. Since 1970, Texas's emissions have quadrupled while the national average has stayed roughly flat. That's more than double the growth of the next fastest growing state, Florida. As for what's driving these emissions, the numbers tell a pretty clear story. The main culprit is the state's massive industry sector, especially oil and gas extraction. In fact, Texas accounts for almost half of the increase in nationwide industrial emissions since 1970. But it's not alone. Transportation and power generation are also major contributors. Together they account for nearly 2/3 of total emissions. The electricity sector was once the largest source of emissions in Texas, but thanks to the retirement of coal plants and growth in renewable energies such as wind power, it has seen a decline in recent years. Emissions in the sector dropped by about 19% over 17 years. On the flip side, emissions from transportation and industry have grown by 63% and 45% respectively during that same period. Now here's where the situation gets interesting. Texas is leading the nation in wind power. It boasts the largest wind fleet in the U.S. and provides approximately 7.5% of the country's total wind energy capacity. This is enough to power about 2.3 million homes. Add in the fact that it also ranks second in the nation for solar energy production, accounting for about 10% of the country's total solar generating capacity. Yet somehow Texas still remains the top greenhouse gas emitter in the country. With all this in mind, you might wonder what's being done about the issue. Well, the answer is not much. You see, although Texas has made some progress in reducing emissions from the electricity sector, overall the state's emissions keep going up. And it looks like things aren't going to change much anytime soon. For example, despite the growth of wind power, Texas currently has a wave of proposed natural gas power plants. According to the nonprofit group Evergreen Action, there are about 130 projects with a combined potential generating capacity of 52 gigawatts. If all these plants were to be built, they could bring Texas' annual greenhouse gas emissions up an additional 13% above 2021 levels, releasing an extra 115 million metric tons of greenhouse gases every year. And as you might expect, state officials have been indifferent or even hostile to the idea of addressing climate change. In 2021, Texas state agencies spent $0 on climate change mitigation efforts. And bills aimed at addressing climate change in the state have often stalled. And with Republicans taking control of the Texas government in 2023, there is very little hope that anything will change in the near future. One thing that may help, though, is that Texas is subject to federal regulations requiring major greenhouse gas emitters to obtain permits under the Clean Air Act. The EPA's plan would limit new gas-fired plants to a carbon dioxide pollution limit of 90% below their potential emissions. But unfortunately, there are signs that state regulators may be violating the law by issuing permits for some large gas-fired plants without the stringent emission limits required federally. And this isn't the first time the state has faced accusations like this. In 2023, the EPA rejected permits issued by the state for 3 gas-fired plants that allowed them to commit unlimited carbon pollution. Texas has appealed the decision, and the case is pending. But this all begs the question, why is Texas doing so poorly when it comes to climate change? Well, to be fair, it's not entirely their fault. Some of it can be traced back to our society's energy needs and consumption habits. The rise in emissions is partly driven by population growth and economic expansion. And many of the largest emitting states, including Texas, are experiencing rapid population growth and urbanization. People need energy to live their daily lives, and as cities grow, the demand for energy to power those cities also grows. Additionally, the types of industries that tend to locate themselves in these areas are often high-emitting. Texas, for example, has become a hub for manufacturing and refining due to factors such as a large workforce and proximity to international shipping lanes. But these industries come with a trade-off in terms of emissions. Oil and gas extraction is a prime example of this. Texas's vast oil reserves have attracted companies from around the world, turning the state into an epicenter for drilling and refining activities. These operations not only contribute significantly to the state's economy, but also to its total emissions. The booming petrochemical industry in Texas is another factor driving up emissions. The state has experienced a surge in the production of plastics and other petrochemicals in recent years, driven by the availability of cheap natural gas feedstock and a growing global demand for these products. This growth has led to increased emissions from these industries. That's not to say Texas has no role to play in cutting down on emissions, because it does. After all, if Texas had the same emissions intensity as the rest of the country, it would cut its emissions by 40%. But the fact is, many of the drivers of Texas's emissions are linked to our collective societal choices and habits. We have to find ways to reduce the energy demands of our growing cities and find common ground on clean energy initiatives at both the state and federal level. And until then, states like Texas will continue to grapple with the challenge of balancing economic growth with environmental responsibility. I'm really curious what you think. Is there a state that should be on this list? Should we make a part 2? Let me know in the comments. Also, please stay tuned if you want to see more videos on climate change. I'll be taking a deep dive into this topic. Texas has been America's biggest polluter for decades, and it shows no signs of slowing down anytime soon. Texas is the highest emitting state by far and is responsible for 1/6 of all climate pollution in the United States. So, how is this possible? I mean, California has nearly 10 times more people than Texas. And what makes Texas even more puzzling is that it also has the second highest percentage of electricity generation from renewables in the country, behind only Iowa. So how can Texas be the most polluting state, when it is also the state with the second highest amount of renewable energy capacity in the country? Well, it comes down to a few key reasons, some of which are easy to understand and some of which are a little bit more nuanced. The first reason why Texas is America's biggest polluter is the same reason why Texas is the world's largest producer of crude oil. The answer, of course, is fossil fuels. Texas is the nation's largest producer of crude oil and natural gas, responsible for about 43% of U.S. crude oil and 27% of natural gas production. It should come as no surprise then that the state's economy revolves around these industries, which brings in hundreds of billions of dollars every year. Oil and gas extraction, refining and petrochemical manufacturing drive the Texas economy, and they drive it in a very big way. This means that the entire state's infrastructure is built up around supporting this industry, including transportation routes, storage facilities, pipelines, ports, and more. So when Texas produces an exorbitant amount of fossil fuels, there are many different industries and jobs created that also rely on the fossil fuel supply chain. Of course, all of these industries are incredibly energy intensive and therefore emit huge amounts of greenhouse gases. One study found that in 2019 alone, Texas emitted a total of 748 million metric tons of greenhouse gases. In fact, Texas has been the No. 1 emitter of greenhouse gases since 2000, and before that it was always either No. 1 or No. 2. This shouldn't come as much of a surprise given that Texas is home to one of the largest petroleum deposits on Earth, the Permian Basin. The Permian Basin sits underneath a large portion of western Texas and eastern New Mexico and is responsible for the rapid rising U.S. oil production over the last decade. The sheer scale of the Permian Basin is really hard to wrap your mind around, but just know that there are thousands of oil wells spread out across hundreds of thousands of acres of land, and that each well produces hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil per day. The Permian Basin covers an area larger than the entire state of Connecticut and produces more than 5 million barrels of oil every single day. That's about 1/3 of all oil produced in the United States. On top of that, Texas also contains the largest natural gas field on Earth, the South Texas Eagle Ford Shale. Just like the Permian Basin, this geologic region spanning across hundreds of thousands of acres of land is dotted with thousands of natural gas wells that pump out billions of cubic feet of natural gas every day. Once again, the scale here is hard to wrap your mind around, but the South Texas Eagle Ford Shale produces 10 billion cubic feet of natural gas every day, which is almost exactly enough to supply all of the homes and businesses in the state of Florida with natural gas for an entire year. All of this oil and natural gas extraction, refining and processing happens to take place in one of the hottest climates on Earth, meaning that air conditioners are running at full blast pretty much 24 hours a day to keep workers safe. These energy-intensive operations account for roughly 2/3 of all emissions in the state. Another important piece of the puzzle is that the industrial sector in Texas accounts for 28% of the state's emissions. A good chunk of those emissions come from energy-intensive petrochemical and refining operations that we talked about earlier. But other industries like chemical manufacturing, iron and steel production, paper manufacturing, cement production, food processing and fabricated metal product manufacturing also play a large role in the state's pollution output. Most of these industries are located along the Gulf Coast of Texas, where many oil refineries and petrochemical plants exist. These facilities, which often operate around the clock, use fossil fuels for energy and release pollutants into the air, soil and water, posing risks to human health and the environment. The Gulf Coast of Texas has historically been an area with a high concentration of petrochemical and refining facilities due to its proximity to the large oil and gas reserves in the southern part of the state, as well as its access to cheap transportation routes like the Gulf of Mexico and several major railroads. Now we move on to the next major culprit for Texas emissions, transportation. According to the EPA, the transportation sector in Texas is responsible for 27% of the state's emissions. When it comes to vehicle miles traveled per capita, Texas ranks 4th in the nation. Also, Texas has the 3rd highest number of passenger vehicles per capita and the 2nd highest number of heavy-duty vehicles per capita in the nation. This is partly because Texans drive a lot. In fact, Texas has the highest number of miles driven per person in the United States. This is likely due to a combination of factors like low fuel prices, affordable land and vehicles, sprawling cities, limited public transit options, and a general preference for driving among Texans. On top of all that, Texas has one of the lowest rates of carpooling in the country. All of this adds up to major emissions from the transportation sector. The vast majority of these emissions come from light-duty vehicles like cars and trucks, which accounted for 84% of the transportation sector's emissions in 2021. Heavy-duty vehicles like buses, heavy trucks and trains accounted for about 10% of transportation emissions, while aircraft, ships, and other modes of transportation accounted for the remaining 6%. Now this is where things get a little interesting. While heavy-duty vehicles only make up about 10% of transportation emissions, they do account for 53% of transportation-related pollution in Texas. This is because heavy-duty vehicles tend to be powered by diesel engines, which are less efficient and produce more pollution than gasoline-powered engines used in light-duty vehicles. On top of that, Texas has over 180 fossil fuel power plants, which account for another 12% of the state's emissions. There are 144 natural gas-fired power plants, 31 coal-fired and 5 oil-fired. Coal-fired plants emit significantly more carbon dioxide than natural gas-fired plants. And it is worth pointing out that Texas is home to some of the largest coal-fired power plants in the entire world. Despite all of this, electricity and heat production actually only make up about 12% of Texas emissions, which might seem surprising given that Texas is a large energy producer. That's because Texas has recently seen a massive increase in wind power. In fact, Texas now generates more electricity from wind than any other state by far. In 2022, Texas installed over 7,000 megawatts of new wind power, accounting for 45% of the national total. On top of that, solar power is growing rapidly in Texas. In 2022, Texas installed 3,400 megawatts of new solar capacity, which was 18% of the national total. This means that while fossil fuels still account for the vast majority of electricity generation in Texas, the trend is slowly beginning to shift towards clean energy. However, it's not shifting fast enough. Even with these recent increases in renewable energy, Texas still emits more carbon dioxide than any other state and accounts for 1/6 of all climate pollution in the United States. Between 1970 and 2021, Texas emissions increased by 186% compared to a national average of 57%. Even after peaking in 2007, emissions have only decreased by about 4%. And that is largely due to a decline in the electricity and heat production sector caused by the switch from coal to natural gas. Since 2021, emissions have actually ticked back up. Now, admittedly, these numbers are overall averages, and they don't paint a picture of what is happening on the ground in different parts of the state. For example, the oil and gas extraction sector produces about 3 times more emissions in the Permian Basin region than the statewide average. And in certain communities, these emissions are even higher. Some of these facilities emit more than 1 million metric tons of greenhouse gases annually, which is equivalent to the annual emissions of a medium-sized company. So why does Texas have such high emissions even though it's building up its renewable energy capacity? Well, it comes down to a few factors. First of all, the political attitude towards climate change in Texas is relatively hostile or at least indifferent. Both Republicans and Democrats in Texas receive significant funding from the fossil fuel industry, which makes it difficult to pass legislation that would negatively affect the industry. Secondly, Texas has a lot of oil and natural gas, and it hasn't yet found a way to get rid of it. Switching away from fossil fuels will require a massive investment in new infrastructure, which will be expensive and time-consuming. Finally, Texas is a large state with a large population and a large economy. It needs a lot of energy to power its businesses and homes. All of these factors combine to make Texas the highest emitter of greenhouse gases in the United States. According to a new report by the American Society of Civil Engineers, Texas is planning to spend $160 billion on infrastructure projects over the next 5 years. About $55 billion of that will come from federal funds. Out of the $55 billion in federal funds, $33 billion will go towards expanding highways. Now, I'm not saying that all highway expansion projects will be bad for the environment. Transit-oriented development projects that increase density around transit stations can actually improve the sustainability of transportation systems. But the new funding formula makes it unlikely that Texas will invest in anything other than more highway lanes. As a result, it is highly unlikely that Texas will slow down its emissions anytime soon. In fact, it's more likely that they will continue to grow. All things considered, it shouldn't be a surprise that Texas is America's biggest polluter. It has a massive fossil fuel industry that powers its economy. A sprawling transportation network that relies heavily on personal vehicles and tens of millions of residents who need to be powered with electricity. While Texas is taking steps to increase its renewable energy capacity, it's not doing so at a pace that will significantly reduce its emissions anytime soon. And until that changes, Texas will continue to be America's biggest polluter. I hope you enjoyed learning about why Texas is the most polluting state in the United States. If you did, please hit that thumbs up button and consider subscribing. And as always, thanks for watching. Texas is often thought of as a laggard when it comes to climate action. After all, it is home to a major fossil fuel industry and was long resistant to any kind of statewide limits on greenhouse gas emissions. But a closer look at the data tells a more complicated story. Texas has undertaken some major efforts to spur renewable energy, which have resulted in real emissions reductions, particularly in the power sector. So how effective have these efforts been? And what does this mean for the state's climate goals? We'll explore this and more in this edition of Taking on a Big Climate Challenge. First, let's get a quick understanding of where Texas stands. As of the latest available data from 2021, Texas is the largest state economy in the U.S. and ranks second in total greenhouse gas emissions behind only California. Within that, electricity and heat production accounted for the highest share of emissions at about 28%, followed by agriculture, forestry and fishing at 25%, and then transportation and industry at around 21% each. These shares are fairly typical compared to other states, but the sheer size of the Texas economy means it's an outlier in terms of total emissions. So what actions has Texas taken to address its emissions? Since the early 2000s, Texas has required electric utilities to increase the share of renewables in their portfolio. The Renewable Portfolio Standard currently sets a goal of 30% by 2025. The standard applies to utilities providing electricity to more than 200 customers and accounts for about 2/3 of the state's retail electric sales. A related policy offers tax credits for renewable energy systems, while another provides grants for rural Texas communities seeking renewable energy projects. Both of these policies have spurred renewable energy growth in the state. Texas now leads the nation in wind power generation, which constituted about 20% of the state's electricity supply as of recent years, with solar power growing rapidly as well. Together, renewables make up roughly 30% of Texas electricity generation. That's significantly above the national average of just over 11%, though some other states like Iowa and Nebraska are also seeing rapid growth. This growth in renewable energy has helped reduce the carbon intensity of Texas' electricity grid. Wind and solar are obviously zero-emission energy sources, so their rise has displaced fossil fuel generation, especially natural gas, which has declined from about 39% of the state's electricity generation in 2010 to just under 30% today. The state's share of coal-powered electricity generation has also shrunk from about 16% to under 8% during the same period. But the impact of renewables on total emissions is limited because they only account for one sector of the economy. Most of Texas's emissions come from industry and transportation. Indeed, while the electricity sector saw a 22% decrease in emissions between 2005 and 2021, overall emissions grew by 24% over the same time period. This makes Texas an outlier among states, which on average reduced emissions from the power sector by 18% while overall emissions grew by just 8%. So what progress has been made outside of the electricity sector? Much of Texas's emissions reduction efforts beyond renewables have focused on voluntary but incentivized measures that cover multiple sectors. The first strategy is the Texas Emissions Reduction Plan, or TERP, which was created in 1991 to reduce ozone non-attainment areas in the state. Over the years, it has expanded to include other pollutants and covers various sectors such as transportation, industry, buildings, and energy. One component of the plan is the Texas Pollutant Reduction Grant Program, which provides funding to entities undertaking projects that reduce emissions of criteria pollutants and greenhouse gases. Another program within the plan is the Alternative Fuel and Advanced Technology Vehicles AFATV Voucher Program, which offers rebates to buyers purchasing eligible vehicles. Then there's the Refrigerant Management Plan, which aims to reduce emissions of hydrofluorocarbons or HFCs from various sources. These programs have yielded results. Between 2015 and 2021, Texas reduced criteria pollutant emissions by 67 tons, including volatile organic compounds by 55% and nitrogen oxides by 54%. These reductions translate to about 26 million avoided asthma attacks and other respiratory impacts. Greenhouse gas emission reductions are harder to quantify, but a study by the nonprofit American Action Forum found that if Texas fully implements DRP, it would result in 35 million metric tons of emission reductions through 2030. Another strategy is the Texas Water Plan, a comprehensive blueprint for managing water resources across the state that includes considerations for environmental sustainability. Its goals include reducing demands on surface and groundwater supplies and improving coordination among water management entities. It calls for investments in infrastructure improvements such as water recycling facilities, as well as public education campaigns to promote conservation. Though it doesn't explicitly set emission reduction targets, one projection estimates that full implementation of the plan's supply-side strategies alone would avoid 16.6 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by 2030. Finally, there's the Texas Energy and Emissions Reduction Strategies, which focus on voluntary measures such as a business-led initiative called the Texas Business Energy and Emissions Reduction Strategy. This initiative helps companies develop emissions reduction plans and implement measures such as building retrofits, switching to renewable energy, and optimizing equipment performance. So what can we learn from Texas? There are some important caveats to keep in mind when analyzing Texas's case. First, the state's emission reduction efforts, especially the ones highlighted here, rely heavily on voluntary measures. This can be an effective way to spur action, but success depends on continued engagement and investments from businesses and other stakeholders. Second, the timeline for many of these programs and initiatives is quite extended, with some stretching beyond 2030. So it will still be a while before we see the full impacts. And third, it's essential to consider equity implications. Some communities may disproportionately bear the burden of pollution and emissions without receiving the benefits of emission reductions. We need to better understand who is shouldering the costs and who is reaping the rewards. That said, there are some valuable lessons to draw. One is that even in a fossil fuel-heavy state like Texas, deep decarbonization of the power sector is possible, and that this can result in real emissions reductions. Texas's experience shows that increasing renewable energy targets and creating supportive policies can help drive down emissions from electricity generation. Second, a combination of carrot and stick approaches can help achieve emissions reductions. Texas's emissions trading program has shown that market-based mechanisms can effectively limit emissions from certain facilities. Meanwhile, its Renewable Portfolio Standard and emissions reduction plans have incentivized investment in cleaner technologies and practices. Third, focusing on multiple sectors and pollutants simultaneously can lead to co-benefits. Texas's multi-pronged approach to emissions reduction has not only addressed climate change concerns, but also improved air quality and public health. Finally, setting clear targets and regularly reviewing and updating them is crucial. Texas's emissions reduction plans include provisions for ongoing progress reporting and future updates, which helps ensure continued commitment and action. In conclusion, Texas has made significant strides in incorporating renewables into its energy mix and reducing emissions from electricity generation. Policies like the Renewable Portfolio Standard have been instrumental in driving the growth of wind and solar energy. Additionally, programs like TERP and the Texas Water Plan have incentivized emissions reductions across various sectors. While these efforts have yielded notable results in decarbonizing the power sector and improving air quality, translating these gains into substantial overall emissions reductions remains a challenge given the dominance of industry and transportation in Texas's emissions profile. To make further progress, deepening decarbonization efforts across all sectors while ensuring equitable outcomes for all communities will be crucial. And thank you for watching.